Thank you very much. And I admire your endurance, all of you up there. And I'm going to test it heavily by my talk, which I'm now 17 minutes late, so we're going to go a little bit further. That's okay. No, I understand running a conference like this. Good to be back at St. Olaf. I've been here many times over the years and still admire its commitment to keeping its soul alive, its Lutheran soul alive, and it seems to me that it's still around kicking, so I'm pleased about that. What I'm going to do is have three different sections to my talk. One, our polarized situation, trying to understand where we are in this American society at this time, including its religious dimension. Secondly, perhaps more controversially, trying to live as a Christian in a polarized church and in a splitting church. And thirdly, how the church should try to live in a polarized political situation. Those are big topics, and I will take them on as best I can. Actually, I should add to the title Christian teacher, because that's what I was called to do from a pretty early age. And so I'm looking upon this as somebody that trying to be a Christian teacher in a polarized church and society. Coming Apart, that influential book by Charles Murray, yes, that Charles Murray, analyzes the increasing division between the educated classes and the white working and lower classes, and the grim features of life among the latter. But I take the phrase more generally as descriptive of the overall trajectory of life in America in my lifetime. Let me explain. I was born in a year with one of the lowest birth rates on record, 1937, and came of age in the late 1940s and 50s. I went to graduate school from 1960 to 65, years that were really an extension of the 50s. Those formative years were characterized by a rare coherence in American life, the smooth operation of what Robert Benne called the Republican and biblical traditions provided the cultural guidance system of American life. Politically, it made the differences between Republicans and Democrats barely discernible. Economic growth lifted all boats and offered the promise of social mobility for everyone. Culturally, the Judeo-Christian ethic was deeply embedded in the code of conduct. Churches did not have to teach the Christian worldview on marriage and sexual ethics. It would have been shocking for anyone even to use the word sex at Grace Lutheran Church in West Point, Nebraska, but we all knew what was right. No sex before marriage, children only after marriage, and marriage is permanent. Even that fine Lutheran singer Frank Sinatra sang, "Love and marriage, they go together like a horse and carriage." Whole families enjoyed the same pop music. Of course, it was not a perfect time. Women's were limited by sharply defined gender roles. Blacks suffered under racism and segregation. Gays and lesbians had to stay in the closet. But nearly everyone I know, including the women of my generation, thought it was a wonderful time to grow up. All sorts of paeans to the 50s circulate the internet, gobbled up by my contemporaries, those who use computers but resist iPhones. Indeed, we engaged in the liberal idealism of the early 60s, my graduate school years, when the civil rights, anti-poverty, and community organization movements promised to address some of the underlying problems of American life. After the shocking assassination of John Kennedy in 1963, Lyndon Johnson passed through his vigorous Great Society policies to aid those movements. All that was shattered by the upheaval of the 60s, which I believe was the decade from 1965 to 75. The divisive and tragic Vietnam War provided the occasion for the rise of radical politics and economics, but the most lasting upheaval was in cultural life. The rise of feminism, multiculturalism, the gay and lesbian movement, nascent environmentalism, black power, and anti-imperialism all emerged with vigor in the 60s. The election of Richard Nixon soon quelled political radicalism and recession. And a recession, one happened in the early 70s, always prompts leaders to grow the economy rather than to redistribute its rewards. But the Cultural Revolution was unstoppable. Parents could no longer listen to the same music as their kids. fact, I thought that when Elvis sang "You Ain't Nothing for a Hound Dog," that kind of marked the beginning of the end of Western civilization. There were many gains from these movements, certainly. But as each nascent initiative burrowed its way into American society, division and later polarization ensued. Over the decades following, what Martin Marty called the culture was dispersed into subcultures. The biblical Republican guidance system was fractured. Add to that economic dynamics that rewarded the highly educated technocratic classes and punished the working classes, and you have a formula for increased polarization and the election of Donald Trump. Both the successful, highly educated and the descending working classes slowly distanced themselves from religious involvement. The nones, N-O-N-E-S, increased dramatically. The highly educated, now secular progressives, making up about 20% of the population, take over the commanding heights of the culture, education in general, but higher education in particular. Government bureaucracies, entertainment, the media, news, and now even sports. They accentuate identity politics and call for inclusion and diversity. They embrace feminism, abortion, environmentalism, multiculturalism, anti-imperialism, and the LGBTQ agenda. They enlist the power of large organizations and other public organizations, such as the NCAA and the NBA, who are terrified that they might be viewed as intolerant or exclusive. They distrust classic Christianity for many reasons. It believes in revealed truth, for one thing, but mainly because of its qualms, classic Christianity's qualms about the sexual revolution, which is now pressing for transgenderism after winning its battle on the right to marry for gays and lesbians. The secular progressives want religion confined to private life. They tend toward the Democratic Party 4-1. The economic and cultural losers, the white lower and middle classes, turn to populist politics as the only instrument they have to fight back. They become avid Trumpsters. But a portion of them also distance themselves from Christianity and are tempted toward white nationalism. But most of all, many of the losing classes suffer from the loss of a marriage and family culture, and they descend into chaos. They assuage their pain by drugs and other self-destructive behavior. Black families suffer many of the same dysfunctions as the white lower classes, but they have hope for the expansion of the welfare state and continue to trust in the Democratic Party. What the University of Virginia Study of Family Cultures calls the faith culture, 20% of the American population, feels increasingly embattled in a culture dominated by secular progressives who want religiously based moral values, especially regarding sexual ethics, to get out of public life. The celebrated cases of florists and bakers punished for their recalcitrance in participating in ceremonies that violate their beliefs strike fear into their hearts. They want the freedom to exercise their religion publicly in their working lives and in their church-related institutions. Though the faithful, that 20%, had great ambivalence toward Donald Trump, some simply could not vote for him, the majority nevertheless did support him, and mainly because of his promise to nominate Supreme Court justices who will protect religious freedom. The faith culture, 20%, tends toward the Republican Party, 4-1. What about mainline Protestantism? All of them have suffered schism, which we will discuss later. Even after the schisms, they are divided at the grassroots level between the lingering faith culture and members who want to accommodate to the progressive culture. Denominational leadership beyond the parish continues to press the progressive agenda, which they believe is consistent with their faith. Pastors, now recognizing how fragile the situation is, try to avoid hot-button issues that will divide their congregations further. Even so, the mainline denominations experience a free fall. Mark Granquist has pointed out that even bracketing out those members lost to two new Lutheran denominations, the ELCA lost 1.2 million members. Part of that decline, of course, for all mainline denominations, must be attributed to the waning notion that to be an American means to be a Protestant, Catholic, or Jew. It is no longer fashionable to belong to a religious communion, especially for the highly educated. Indeed, given the cultural shifts mentioned above, it is slightly disreputable to be conventionally religious. Those who were once casual but friendly Christians have departed, The result is that they have morphed into secular progressives who resist any publicly relevant religion unless it supports the progressive agenda. In that case, liberal religion gets a free pass. Catholics would have registered a similar free fall without the influx of Hispanics to America. After a resurgence of classic Catholicism under two popes, John Paul II and Benedict XVI, Francis gives off mixed signals. Prominent Catholics in political roles accommodate to the secular progressive agenda. But there are many classic Catholics left in the church. They too voted for Trump for the same reasons the conservative Protestants did. Catholicism itself would be probably divided if it didn't have such a strong magisterial tradition. Catholics leave rather than try to start a new Catholic church. That's my take on the polarization of society. Now I move on to something some of us have painfully experienced, a polarized church and a polarized society. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in America did not escape the polarizing trends set loose in the 60s and proceeding through the later decades. I thought its confessional tradition and its commitment to serious biblical and theological reflection might insulate it from those trends. I thought there were settled teachings on key issues that would weather the divisions that were plaguing the larger society. But all that was nullified by the unfolding formation of the ELCA. The centuries-long trend toward Lutheran unity was soon to be dramatically reversed into disunity. I will not address the conflict in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod that led to schism in the mid-70s. That's another story. Indeed, in many ways, the ELCA anticipated the changes that were soon to come upon the larger society. The new church early on built the spirit of the 60s right into its DNA. By the mid-80s, the Committee for a New Lutheran Church was heavily conditioned by the strong voices of feminism, black and gay liberation, multiculturalism, and anti-imperialism. They were successful in instituting a widely disliked quota system to empower the excluded. Blacks at 2% of the membership were represented at all committees at 10%. Women at 50%, and that at a time where there were not many women pastors. The planners marginalized bishops and theologians from any real power, viewing them as one more interest group that was under suspicion for its male dominance. They began transforming the language of worship, coming within 3 votes of banning the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit from the language of worship. They promised that this would be a really new church and not like your father's church or your mother's church, and they succeeded in founding something pretty new in 1989. The new church elicited enough concern that 2 large call to faithfulness conferences were held on the campus of this college in the early 90s. Some of you may remember those. Attended by over 1,000 lay and clergy Lutherans. Organized by the 3 independent Lutheran journals, Lutheran Forum, Dialogue, and Lutheran Quarterly, they were shots across the bow of the ELCA. One editor quipped that the conferences were the only things that kept the ELCA from already becoming a united Church of Christ. It seems that the concerns that elicited the conferences were widely shared. Membership losses slowly increased in the 90s, averaging 12,500 a year. But the resistance only slowed liberationist themes in their march through the institutions. For conservative Lutherans, the annoyances continued to build up. Constant purging of the language of worship and theological speech from male pronouns and images, including also military images, a ministry to political actors morphing into advocacy offices whose preferences track closely with the politics of the left wing of the Democratic Party, including its distancing itself from the support for Israel. Its incredibly bad statement on sex in the early 90s, which had to be withdrawn, and its presiding bishop giving advice to politicians on every topic under the sun. But 2 moves in the late 90s provided to be the last straw for many Lutherans, so serious that they were church dividing, not just annoyances. One was the insistence of the ELCA that ordinations of Lutheran clergy had to be legitimated by the presence of episcopal bishops in the apostolic succession. Hidden under that hubbub was, over that move was an even more serious departure from Christian teaching, this time having to do with the Great Commission. The Board of Global Missions, fueled by the conviction that pioneer missionary work, pioneer meaning you're bringing the gospel to those peoples who have never heard it, was so contaminated by cultural and political imperialism that it moved to suspend all such pioneer mission work and confined itself to accompaniment, that is, helping already established churches at their bidding. The ELCA and Assembly confirmed both decisions. Those moves precipitated the departure of several hundred congregations who gathered into an association of congregations called Lutheran Congregations in Mission for Christ. It was birthed by an organization, an earlier one called Word Alone, which then went out of business when LCMC was formed. Losses of membership from 2001 to 2009 accelerated to 63,000 a year. A nagging issue that perplexed conservative Lutherans of all stripes was the refusal of the ELCA to teach a pro-life message or to participate in any pro-life movements or advocacy efforts. One of the crucial values, Christian values, deep respect for nascent life, that was characteristic of Christianity from its inception, was simply ignored by the national church and generally the synodical churches. From the beginning of the ELCA, activist groups, especially one called Lutherans Concerned, agitated for the moral acceptance of homosexual conduct, which would then lead to the blessing, soon to morph into marriage, of gay unions and the ordination of married gays. Their initiatives in due time found welcoming gestures by the bureaucracy of the ELCA, many of its bishops, and most of its seminaries and educational institutions, including St. Olaf. This alarmed a whole new contingent of classic Lutherans who formed resistance groups called Solid Rock and Lutheran Core, Lutheran Coalition for Reform. They built networks that impeded the move toward gay marriage and ordination in the assemblies of 2005, 2007. But the momentum of sexual liberation or marriage equality was relentless. The church-wide assembly of 2009 voted narrowly to accept a social statement on sexual ethics that was ambivalent about every issue under debate, and more decisively, however, that assembly decisively voted to bless gay unions and ordain married or partnered gays. It accepted the last two motions without any serious biblical or theological argument. Classic Christian teaching of thousands of years' duration was overturned by the vote of the church assembly. A rogue tornado struck the neighborhood of the assembly as it voted on these sexuality issues, knocking the steeple off a Lutheran church nearby. I leave the interpretation of that event to our latter-day prophets. That was the last straw for a larger group of Lutherans. In 2010 and 2011, an average of 241,000 Lutherans left per year, and over 700 congregations departed. The autumn after the 2009 decisions featured a meeting of more than 1,000 members of CORE, who then planned the birth of a new Lutheran denomination, the North American Lutheran Church, which was organized in the summer of 2010. It claims to be a centrist Lutheran body in America, bordered on one side by the conservative LCMS, Missouri Synod, and on the other by a liberal Protestant ELCA. Now at long last, we come to the question, what does it mean to try to live as a Christian teacher in a polarized and then splitting church? For my wife and me, it meant leaving the church, the ULCA, the LCA, and the ELCA, into which we were born. I had been deeply involved in the formation and work of both Solid Rock and CORE for their 4 years of formal organizational resistance, but had written and spoken in opposition to the general direction of the ELCA was taking since its inception. When all our efforts came to naught in the 2009 assembly, I felt a great sense of relief. I then felt free from continuing efforts to resist. Game over. My ambivalent membership in the ELCA was clarified. I joined the efforts to establish a new church and was soon elected to its Commission on Theology and Doctrine. A friend of mine, Carl Broughton, a St. Olaf graduate, and I organized a yearly Young Theologians workshop with the intent of incubating a new generation of theologians for the North American Lutheran Church, as well as conducting a yearly theological conference on important issues that drew over 500 attendees. These lectures are now called, since both Carl and I have retired, the Broughton-Benne Lectures in Theology, and they precede the annual North American Lutheran Church convocations. So we cast our lot with a new church. When a neighboring parish in Roanoke, we live in Southwest Virginia, became North American Lutheran Church, we left the church in Salem we belonged to for 33 years, though that church had kept its Orthodox teaching intact. We have deeply enjoyed our move to a large and flourishing parish, which defines itself as liturgical, sacramental, and Orthodox. Right now, I am teaching an adult class on the historic Christian teaching on marriage and sexual ethics. It is wonderful to have our convictions match the stance of the local and national churches to which we belong. Integrity is an important virtue. Indeed, it is healthful for the soul to be for something, to build a future, rather than to be constantly in an oppositional stance. In our transition, we have tried to act as Christians in this divisive situation. Here are the principles we tried to follow. Leave a church, national and local, only when we and other thoughtful and mature Christians are convinced that core Christian teachings have been rejected. In this case, a crucial element of the Great Commission, as well as clear biblical and traditional teaching, Christian teaching on the nature of marriage. It made both fateful moves, the ELCA made both faithful moves without biblical and theological arguments that would have had to have been overwhelming in order to overturn centuries of settled Christian teaching. Of course, the ELCA doesn't see these departures as church dividing issues, but that seems empirically doubtful since over 1 million Lutherans have left, and theologically indispensable given my own reading of the role of marriage in the Christian tradition. It is not a second-order teaching. Number 2, exercise prudence in making our decision to leave. We could have agitated in our local parish for it to leave, and if successful, begin a movement within the synod, for more churches, perhaps the whole synod, to leave. But our judgment was that such action would be futile and result merely in bitter division. The bishop of the synod and members of his staff belong to our former parish, and the synod itself is permeated by a familial ethos in which belonging trumps believing. Agitation would have brought only conflict and loss. We decided to leave in peace. Number 3 principle, exercise patience and charity toward those who stayed. We wrote a letter of departure to our congregation with the reasons we were leaving and did not denounce the parish for their inaction. The pastor understood fully. We have kept our friendships intact, though there is little doubt that we share less with them. We worship there when our children and grandchildren have a part in the church services, but both of us feel, to our surprise, somewhat uncomfortable. We remain on cordial terms with the leadership of the synod, though we no longer participate in any of its functions. This patience and charity is reinforced by the continuing prospect that our decisions may have been wrong, in which case we ask the forgiveness of God and our opponents. Fourthly, we pray for a renewal and reform of the church, including the ELCA and the NALC, and pray constantly to examine our own conscience, and me particularly as a Christian teacher, and that of other teachers, that they may do the same before the biblical warning in James 3, verse 1, that, quote, "Not many of you should become teachers in the church, for we who teach will be judged more strictly." Third section, the church's role in a polarized political situation. A couple of years ago, I wrote the Lutheran chapter in a book edited by Amy Black, who probably is still here, called 5 Views on Church and Politics. Little did I know how relevant that book would be for the election of 2016. I taught it to a large class at our new parish last fall, aiming at concerted reflection on how Christians should think about the election. I supplemented that text with a little book mentioned earlier called Good and Bad Ways to Think About Religion and Politics. The course became very intense when it became clear that Donald Trump was the Republican candidate. In both books, I argue that Christians should not separate their core Christian convictions from their political judgments, nor should they fuse them, kind of a theme that's been going through this conference. There are those in the secular world who believe that Christians should drop their core beliefs when they enter the public sphere. I call them separationists. And they would like to try to intimidate conservative Christians from bringing their religiously based moral convictions into public life. And such kind of intimidation needs to be overcome by the courage of conservative Christians. But there are Christians who unthinkingly do not connect Sunday and Monday, do not connect their core Christian convictions in politics, and others who quite thinkingly claim that Christians cannot participate in worldly power. Those are the sectarians and the neo-sectarians, or currently very popular, those who Christians should slowly withdraw, which is commended by Rod Dreher in the famous Benedict option that's being discussed. I argue that if God is sovereign over all, we must be obedient in all sectors of life, including politics. And of course, Luther believed that citizenship was a Christian calling. That means connecting faith and politics. But we should not fuse religion and politics. Religionized politics is quite dangerous to society, and politicized religion is even more dangerous, if not fatal, to the church. It domesticates the transcendent claims of the gospel and makes the church one more interest group, and it is treated that way by society and even by Christians. Witness the demise of the National Council of Churches when it fused Christianity too closely with a political position. A significant portion of conservative Christians now recognize the danger of fusion. Amy talked about that last evening. But many more plunge toward fusing faith and politics. The leadership of liberal Protestantism, interestingly enough, seems undisturbed by its commitment to the liberal political agenda, though its grassroots members are far more mixed. This reluctance to fuse religion and politics is also in line with the Lutheran teaching on the two ways that God reigns, the law and the gospel. Politics has to do with the order of creation, which is beholden to God's law, his left hand. It is not the realm of redemption, which is constituted by the gift of the gospel, the reign of God's right hand. To fuse politics and faith is to elevate human work in the order of creation as a replacement for the grace of God in Christ. Penultimate concerns are raised to the level of ultimacy, a formula for idolatry. Rather than separate or fuse religion and politics, we should engage in critical participation. We should be fully aware that the journey from core Christian convictions to political ideologies, parties, and judgments is a very complex and jagged one. There are few straight lines from core Christian convictions to political decisions. In coming to political judgment, one must transverse a number of stages. Which biblical principles are gathered, keying off those biblical ones, working through Christian social teachings, one's political philosophy, one's ordering of the principles of justice, one's reading of the situation, as well as the many impingements of one's social location, including such things as peer pressure, the region where you live, your parents' views on politics, temperament. All these things are accounted for. When they're all accounted for, it's difficult to brand any decision the Christian one. That is a good reason why we should refrain from having Christian political parties. Given all this, that complexity and jaggedness, we as individual Christians should cut each other a lot of slack in the realm of politics. Even more reluctance should characterize churches. They should rarely support specific parties or legislation. So engage our Christian convictions, but be aware that with each step, from core to policy, Christians of goodwill and intelligence part company. It's a complex process. This hesitance to claim Christian sanction for political parties and policies is qualified in two ways. Sometimes, and we need the help of the Holy Spirit to discern this, there are parties and policies so wicked that Christians simply must resist, refuse participation, and actively defy. In retrospect, we can see that Bonhoeffer and the Confessing Church were right. Nazism was that wicked. But those two parties, Bonhoeffer and the Confessing Church, were a small minority. Other good Germans were swept away. What policies now would rise to that level of wickedness that would bring defiance and active resistance? Historically, in America, we fought a very painful civil war when the federal government, energized by Christian anti-slavery societies, put down the Confederacy. But what would lead to such level of wickedness now? Big question. But the second qualification is this: Christians of a reasonably orthodox sort ought to be able to move together on three fronts: the protection of religious liberty, which includes the free exercise of religion, the protection of nascent life, and a safety net for those who cannot take care of themselves. Those are merely general directions. There would be much disagreement over exactly what sort of policies would achieve those goals, yet those directions should resonate with all Christians. Back to the election of 2016. After teaching these themes in my Sunday school class, the jaggedness, the complexity of moving from core Christian beliefs to political decisions, we proceeded to discuss this very unusual election. My emphasis also for not confusing ultimate issues with penultimate issues. Those were the background that I had taught. The class was unhappy that they had to choose between a Clinton Democratic dynasty and a Trump populist insurgency, especially when Trump was such a controversial character. As the election neared, I had the class list reasons for: 1, voting for Hillary; 2, voting for Donald; 3, not voting; 4, voting for a third party or write-in candidate. It was a very wholesome process to go through this exercise because it showed that people could actually give reasons for voting for a candidate whom others thought was beyond the pale. The next Sunday, I asked if anyone had the courage to tell the rest of the class how they were going to vote and why. A number of people in the class divulged their choices. I thought that was marvelous, to have the guts to do that, but also the serenity of the group to accept that. I had done enough Lutheran teaching that thoughtful Christians, even though on different sides politically, could respect and calmly disagree in a politically polarized society. Our class, even though theologically conservative, was all over the place politically. The majority still in the painfully undecided camp. They couldn't stand Trump's character. Yet all were engaging their Christian convictions in a very painful way in their political choices. No one expected Trump to win. So the Sunday following the election was one of intense reflection. By then it was clear that many Christians, led by evangelicals of over 88%, although Amy qualified that, the 80% had voted for Trump because of the promise he made to appoint Supreme Court justices that would honor religious liberty and would not be a zealot for the abortion cause. If there were a majority in the class who finally voted for Trump, which I think there was, it was for those reasons: anti-abortion issue and especially the religious liberty issue. No one in the class thought that Trump was a serious Christian or a man of virtue or character. I was proud of how that class unfolded because it was clear that Christians could hold together with love and respect in a highly polarized political situation. I do not think that could have happened. I don't think politics could have been discussed so candidly in a church that was seriously divided theologically. That is, religious solidarity enabled us, and clarity about penultimate ultimate matters enabled us to engage in political tolerance. In short, then, a polarized religious situation in Lutheranism led to a division that separated the progressives from the Orthodox. I'm back now to the conflicted church, the schism. I believe that such a winnowing between the progressives and the Orthodox is going on throughout the world, particularly in the West. But because we could find religious unity, our parish could weather the political polarization handily. We didn't even have to pray for our political enemies because in a Christian point of view, they were our brothers and sisters, not enemies. They were Christian friends. I dearly hope others have been able to find the same unity, forbearance, and peace in the polarized political situation. Genuine Christianity should enable people who disagree theologically and politically to respect each other even as they disagree. We're all created in the image of God and redeemed by Christ. That may not mean that we're in the same churches or the same political parties, but it should mean a little less vitriol, a little less conflict, and a little less polarization. Thank you very much.